Alright, interviews with myself, number 9. This is Trinity College part 3 and Bristol part 1. Now, this is the final part of the Trinity experience. And yeah, I thought I'd mention my first experience of what we call charisma. In 1974, I spent the final year in the genetics department, and there was a very dynamic young genetics lecturer there from Cornell, and he seemed to be the talk of the town. Everybody seemed to think he was young and dynamic and impressive. He dazzled everyone with his style of lecturing, which was supposed to be very avant-garde, cutting edge in this new exciting field of DNA genetics. He was, young and loquacious, talkative like Americans are. And anyway, the lectures took place early in the morning. I remember in the winter, very cold, in a prefabricated structure, which was pretty freezing in winter. And I remember listening to him and wondering really what all the fuss was about. Yes, he was quite dynamic in a way, but he seemed also quite shallow to me. These were my thoughts as I tried to unfreeze the ink from my pen and scribble down meaningless notes which I didn't understand. I didn't understand a word he was saying. Anyway, he was not very good at answering questions. I remember observing that he tended to dismiss the questioner and make them feel rather small. In other words, he was a bully. I suppose this was acceptable in the old days. I imagined him doing that to me, of course, but I never had the nerve to ask him a question. Yeah, so that's all there is for Trinity. And now we'll move on to Bristol. And we'll do it in 2 parts for Bristol, 1974 to 1975, so Bristol University. And yes, so to Bristol. In the 1970s, that hotbed of subversive teacher trainees. Oh yes, left-wingers we were. In retrospect, I have to say it was an adventure, like most of my experience and other chapters in my life. At the time, though, it was a pretty dull and boring place to me, and it was really just another Nixonian outsider experience. In other words, an experience which had to be more endured rather than enjoyed. I was lonely there. I remember darkening evenings in the autumn, trudging up and down the streets of White Ladies Road, killing time, not knowing whether to eat in the pizzeria or the university refectory. Both were soulless places, but the food gave me comfort. This was the beginning of an addiction to salt, one of many addictions in my life. Apart from the terror of my early teaching experiences and the cultural differences between Ulster, the cultural differences actually between Ulster and the south of England soon became very apparent. This was my first experience outside of Ireland. I've always been mystified by comments of people who look back on their university days with nostalgia. People talk about them as if they were a time of relaxation and recreation, on some tropical island. I remember them as grim, to put it charitably. Everything was grim. My apartment, the lectures themselves, many of the lecturers, and even the locals seemed to me to be pretty grim, at first anyway. The city centre of Bristol looked like a bombed-out concrete jungle, which is exactly what it was, of course. It had been bombed heavily in the war. My cooking was grim. The long, lonely evenings, even more lonely weekends, and my first pathetic attempts at teaching were also grim. Above all, the locals seemed pretty grim to me. They were a disappointment. They didn't speak much. They were much more reserved than the Irish, and they seemed to me to rebuff my attempts to approach them. They all seemed to me to be paranoid about someone taking advantage of them in some way. I couldn't work out what it was they had that anyone could possibly covet. Maybe they all had secret stashes of gold somewhere. They were positively allergic to visits to their apartments. Impromptu visits, anyway. You had to make an appointment. They stood in the doorway with a silly grin on their faces, looking over your head into the middle distance, as if there was a SWAT team behind me taking aim at them. They were suspicious of visits. So they valiantly defended whatever it is they were defending from a lonely but well-intentioned, I thought, Ulsterman who just wanted a bit of a chat. They were helpful, of course, but that wasn't what I wanted. The English are doers. Like their Australian derivatives, they're obsessed with doing things. The Irish, on the other hand, just are. We like being, not doing. We're not lazy. We just like to be, if you catch my drift. I always find it difficult to get on with the English. Why did I end up in Bristol? Well, it was like this. I became obsessed with education at Trinity in my final couple of years. I avidly read, noted, and inwardly digested the radical philosophies contained therein of Messrs. Ivan Illich, Everett Reimer, John Goodman, and other anti-establishment Deschoolers of the day. In hindsight, although I thought I was at the time, I was not really interested in teaching in schools, but more in the idea of school, in the theory. I've always been excited by ideas, and I was excited by the idea of education itself. What was it? I had no idea really, but I spent the next several years trying to define it. And in fact, even now, 50 or 60 years later, I still don't really know what it is. Although I probably have a clearer idea of what it is not. Anyway, in those days, I wanted to abolish schools altogether. I believed that, on balance, the negative influences of schools on society outweighed their positive effects. Above all, I believed that it was the hidden curriculum of schools that was the problem. Marshall McCluhan was dead right when he said in his book, "The medium is the message." I agreed. Schools existed to engender conformity and dependence and not to truly empower students. You can see where my present philosophy of teaching and encouraging people to become independent learners comes from, can't you? Anyway, after many, many years, I still believe this. Perhaps with a little bit less passion than I had in the 1970s, but not much less. I do admit that schooling as a default position for a developing culture is perhaps more desirable than some other extreme forms of schooling which we see these days. But, yeah, still that's not to give schools very much credit, is it really? In those days, though, I was so theoretical that it just wasn't true. I was basically offered a place on the PGCE course for teacher trainees at Cambridge by my previous boss at Trinity, Professor George, but unfortunately, no, I wouldn't accept it. No, no, no. And not someone had told little nerdy Nixon that Cambridge was full of failed rugby players, not true educationalists like himself, in pursuit of worthy causes, and who would spend years wasting time trying to define education. True educationalists justifiably scorned the idea of chasing a ridiculously shaped piece of leather, a rugby ball, around a muddy field in order to compete violently with other males for the attention of even dumber females. I was having none of it. I was going to be the most progressive teacher, and I was going to go to the most progressive teacher training course in the United Kingdom at Bristol University. Yes. No, actually, I was not going to consort with rugby players, and I was determined to cut off my nose to spite my face in order to prove it to everyone, including myself. I got the idea of Bristol actually from someone at Trinity who had she was a PhD student in biology, and I'd done a summer vacation work with her. We jointly published a paper. And anyway, so George, my professor, offered me a place in Cambridge. I said, no, I'm going to Bristol because this lady had recommended Bristol to me. So if by any chance you were thinking now at this stage that I was a rather immature and presumptuous prat at this age, I would have to agree that I was. I hope we don't think that I'm the same now. Some might say so. But I think I have faced my demons enough to have changed. I think education became an obsession for me at Trinity because I was such a social misfit. And yeah, so anyway, everyone else seemed to have something they were passionate about, but I had nothing. I was just a nervous wreck, shy. But the one thing I did have, which others didn't have, was a passion for education. Yes, so off I went to Bristol, arriving one cool September night on my own at the Quadrant, Cold Harbour Road, which is off White Ladies Road, to spend a year on learning how to be a teacher. So I think we'll leave it there for the moment.